Most defendants accept their fate and move on. But when Pam Bondi was unexpectedly hit with a hefty fine, she didn't back down. Instead, she fought with such precision that even the judge began questioning his own ruling. That morning, Pam hadn't expected anything unusual. Courtroom 3B in a Tampa courthouse was just another stop on her schedule, a routine hearing, nothing more. She had stood in this room countless times, facing judges with varying levels of experience. Today should have been no different. Seated at the defendant's table, she remained neutral, casually flipping through her notes. Across from her, the city attorney adjusted his tie, shifting in his seat as they both awaited the judge's arrival. The case was minor, procedural, something that should have taken no more than 10 minutes. Then Judge Raymond Dalton walked in, and Pam immediately sensed something was off. Dalton was the kind of man who commanded attention without saying a word. Tall, with a graying beard and deep-set eyes that held an air of authority. Normally, judges would take a moment to review their files, exchange a nod with the attorneys, and settle in before addressing the room. Not Dalton. "Let's get right to it," he announced, his voice flat, unreadable. Pam straightened slightly, picking up on the shift in tone. "The court has reviewed the matter at hand," Dalton continued. "After considering the arguments, I find that the defendant is in violation of Local Statute 14B and is therefore subject to a fine of $10,000, payable immediately." Silence. Pam's brow lifted slightly, though her mind was already racing. A fine, just like that? No discussion, no debate, just a swift final decision. Even the city attorney looked taken aback, as if he hadn't expected the case to move this quickly. Pam folded her hands, keeping her voice measured. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my arguments." Dalton barely blinked. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear, the law is clear." Pam inhaled slowly, keeping her expression unreadable. The room was too still. Something about this felt deliberate. This wasn't just a ruling. It was a message. She studied Dalton carefully. There was something in his eyes, something more than simple judicial authority. He wasn't just deciding a case. He was putting her in her place. Her voice remained steady. "If the law were that clear, Your Honor, we wouldn't be here. I request the opportunity to present my defense." Dalton leaned back slightly, as if he had expected her to push back. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're welcome to try, Ms. Bondi, but I assure you, the outcome will be the same." That's when she knew. This wasn't just about the case. This was about her. Pam adjusted the papers in front of her, more for effect than necessity. The fine itself wasn't the issue. She had fought bigger battles. But the principle? That was something she couldn't ignore. She met Dalton's gaze directly. "Then I suppose we should get started." The tension in the room thickened. City attorney shifted uncomfortably. The court stenographer, who had been silent until now, repositioned in her chair. Even a few spectators in the back leaned forward slightly, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Pam took one last glance at her legal brief. Not that she needed it. She already knew exactly what she was going to do. Dalton thought he had the upper hand. He was about to realize this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. Before anyone could speak again, Pam raised a hand, signaling that she wasn't finished. What happened next would leave the entire courtroom stunned. She let the silence linger, just long enough to make an impact. No rush, no hesitation. Slowly, she turned a single page in her folder, again more for effect than necessity, before looking up at Dalton. "Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something," she said, her voice unwavering. "Are you saying the defense has no right to present arguments in a legal proceeding?" Dalton's expression didn't change. "I'm saying the violation is clear and the fine stands." Pam tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then she nodded. "Interesting." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Pam leaned back just a little, keeping her tone casual. "It's just that I've been practicing law for quite some time. and in all those years I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense before hearing a single word of it." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "It's, what's the phrase, unprecedented." Dalton's jaw tightened, and just like that, the real battle began. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't openly challenging Judge Dalton yet. Instead, she was setting the stage, forcing him to engage. The spectators in the gallery, mostly lawyers and clerks waiting for their cases, were now fully invested. A few exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, a man who had likely sat through 1,000 hearings just like this one, shifted ever so slightly. Dalton exhaled slowly. "Ms. Bondi, this courtroom does not exist for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands and we move on." Pam gave a small, knowing smile. There it was. He had opened the door. She adjusted her papers again, but this time she didn't look down at them. She looked directly at the judge. "Very well. Let's talk about Local Statute 14B, the one you claim I violated." She tapped her finger on the printed document in front of her. "You say the law is clear. That's interesting because this very statute has been challenged multiple times in the past 5 years, with varying interpretations." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "For example," Pam continued, her voice smooth, almost conversational, "the language in subsection C is so vague that it has been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases." She paused, letting that settle. "And let's not forget last year's appellate court ruling, which found that imposing fines under this statute, without allowing for due process, constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections." Silence. Pam could feel the shift happening. Dalton knew it too. He straightened, his tone sharpening. "Those cases do not apply here." Pam didn't miss a beat. "Don't they?" She turned another page. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they do. The language in the ruling from Reynolds versus Clearwater was quite clear. An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds." She let the words sink in before adding, "And I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to ignore precedent." Dalton clenched his jaw. Pam let the tension linger for just a second before delivering the next blow. "Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law, in which case I'd be happy to file an appeal." Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. "Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Ms. Bondi?" Pam exhaled through her nose, a quiet laugh, devoid of amusement. "Your Honor, I don't make threats, I cite the law." A murmur rippled through the back of the courtroom. Pam had done something subtle but significant. She had shifted the power dynamic. No longer was Dalton simply issuing rulings. Now he was being forced to defend them, and he knew it. The city attorney, who had been sitting quietly until now, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if I may." Dalton lifted a hand, silencing him. His eyes remained locked on Pam's. A long pause. Then finally the judge spoke. "Very well. You may present your defense." Pam smiled, but only slightly. She wasn't celebrating yet. This was only the beginning. Just as she was about to speak, Dalton did something that made it clear he wasn't going to make this easy. He didn't break eye contact as he leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Proceed," he said. His voice carried a weight that felt less like permission and more like a warning. Pam recognized the tactic immediately. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about control. He wanted to remind her exactly where she stood, in his courtroom, but intimidation wasn't her style. She adjusted her posture, keeping her expression unreadable. Then with deliberate calm, she tapped her papers. "Let's start with the language of the statute itself." She glanced down. Local Statute 14B states that any entity failing to comply with a municipal regulation may be fined. Simple enough, but the issue arises in how compliance is defined. She let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing. The language is broad, overly vague, and inconsistent with constitutional due process protections. Dalton exhaled slowly, unimpressed. "And yet, Ms. Bondi, this statute has been enforced repeatedly, without issue." Pam tilted her head. That's interesting because according to public records, at least 4 previous cases resulted in partial or full dismissals due to the very vagueness I'm pointing out now. She glanced at the city attorney, then back at Dalton. Unless, of course, you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened slightly. Ms. Bondi, if your argument hinges on vague procedural objections, I suggest you reconsider. The law is enforced as written. Pam let a beat of silence stretch before responding. Except when it isn't. Another murmur from the back of the room. Pam reached for another document and held it up. And just like that, the momentum was hers. Let's talk about Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg, Pam said, her voice steady. In that case, the defendant was fined under this exact statute. Same wording, same enforcement. But the appellate court ruled that the city's interpretation violated state-level protections. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. And do you know what the judge said in that ruling? That the law, as applied, fails to provide sufficient notice or clear standards for enforcement, making it unenforceable under scrutiny. Dalton's face remained impassive, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed him. The city attorney leaned forward. Your Honor, I believe we're getting sidetracked. Pam turned to him before he could continue. Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconcile this ruling with the fine your office is trying to enforce today. If you have a legal basis contradicting... Henderson, please, enlighten us. The attorney hesitated. His silence spoke louder than any argument he could have made. Pam turned back to Dalton. Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment, I'm asking for consistency. If a higher court has already determined this statute is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it? Dalton leaned back, studying her, searching for an angle. He was stalling, buying time to regain control. Finally, he spoke. The circumstances of that case are not identical to yours. Pam didn't blink. True, but the precedent applies all the same. The law is either clear or it isn't. Silence. The air in the room had shifted. Pam knew she had him cornered. Not just legally, but strategically. Any decision he made now would be scrutinized. He could push forward, ignore precedent, and risk having his ruling overturned. Or he could backtrack, admitting, at least implicitly, that he had acted prematurely. She didn't envy his position. But then again, he had put himself there. Dalton exhaled slowly. Ms. Bondi, I find your interpretation debatable. Pam allowed herself the barest hint of a smile. Then let's debate it. Dalton's nostrils flared slightly. Then, to her surprise, he reached for his gavel. The court will take a 15-minute recess. Before anyone could respond, he stood and disappeared into his chambers. Pam set her papers down, her expression composed. But inside, she knew what had just happened. Dalton wasn't ready to concede. But he also wasn't ready to rule against her outright. He needed time. To think. To strategize. Maybe even to look up the case she'd just cited. That meant she had him on the ropes. But when he returned, he wouldn't be alone. And what happened next would take this fight to an entirely different level. The 15-minute recess felt like an hour. Pam remained seated, her hands resting lightly on her stack of papers. She wasn't reading them, she didn't need to. The precedents, the procedural arguments, the case law, they were burned into her mind. She was ready. But something about Dalton's abrupt break didn't sit right with her. He wasn't the type to hesitate, which meant he was either regrouping or preparing for something she hadn't accounted for. When the door to the judge's chambers swung open, Dalton wasn't alone. A second judge entered. Pam recognized him immediately. Judge Alan Whitaker, a senior judge. Higher ranking than Dalton. The moment Whitaker stepped in, the energy in the room shifted. This wasn't standard protocol. Bringing in another judge mid-hearing. That wasn't just unusual, it was calculated. Pam straightened her posture, keeping her expression unreadable. Dalton took his seat, clearing his throat. Before we proceed, I've requested that Judge Whitaker sit in on this matter. Requested? Pam didn't believe that for a second. Someone had pulled strings. Whitaker gave her a slow nod, his presence calm but authoritative. Ms. Bondi, I understand. You've raised procedural concerns regarding the enforcement of Statute 14b? Pam met his gaze evenly. That's correct. Whitaker clasped his hands together. And you believe this fine should be overturned based on appellate precedent? She didn't hesitate. I don't believe it. I know it. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dalton's lips pressed into a thin line. Whitaker arched an eyebrow. I appreciate your confidence, but let's discuss specifics. You referenced Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. Are you aware that a follow-up ruling later clarified that certain interpretations of the statute could remain enforceable under localized judicial discretion? Pam kept her face neutral. So that's what this was. Dalton had stepped back, and now the real fight was about to begin. They had brought in someone with more authority, and now they were attempting to counter her argument with an overlooked technicality. Pam folded her hands. I'm aware of that ruling, Your Honor, but I also know that the same clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards. She let that sink in before adding, which in this case was not done. Whitaker nodded as if he had expected her response. Then let's talk about that. He turned slightly. The enforcement officer who filed the violation is present in this courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him? Pam barely hid her surprise. She hadn't expected that, but she welcomed it. She turned as a man rose from the back of the room. Officer Brian Calloway, Municipal Enforcement. Middle-aged, dressed in a crisp Navy uniform and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who rarely had to justify his decisions. Pam kept her voice steady. Yes, Your Honor, I would. Dalton gestured for Calloway to step forward. The officer made his way to the witness stand, took the oath, and sat down. Pam stood walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Pam turned slightly toward the jury box, empty, except for the public watching from the gallery. And on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred? Calloway exhaled as if the answer was obvious. The statute is clear. The property in question was not in compliance with municipal code. I documented it and issued the fine. Pam clasped her hands behind her back. Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? A brief hesitation. No, ma'am, it wasn't necessary. She gave him a small, almost amused smile. You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine? Calloway shifted in his seat. I have years of experience identifying these cases. I didn't need a photo to confirm what I saw. Pam remained, calm, but inside she knew she had just been handed her next argument on a silver platter. She turned back to the bench. Your Honor, in the absence of photographic evidence, written witness statements, or any tangible proof, we are left with nothing more than an individual's subjective assessment. She paused, then pressed on. This directly contradicts the evidentiary standards required under the appellate clarification Judge Whitaker referenced earlier. Whitaker's expression remained unchanged, but he leaned back slightly. He knew she was right. Pam took another step forward. So I ask again, how does this court justify imposing a fine under a statute that lacks the required legal foundation for enforcement? Silence. Dalton's fingers drummed against the bench. He wasn't looking at Whitaker. That told Pam everything she needed to know. He had expected to win this argument. He had expected Whitaker's presence to corner her. Instead, she had taken his own counterpoint and used it to unravel the case against her. Dalton exhaled sharply. This court will take another recess. Pam resisted the urge to smile. She knew exactly what was happening. They were running out of ways to push back. But when the court reconvened, what Dalton did next was something no one saw coming. As the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, Pam remained seated. Another recess. That wasn't a good sign for them. It meant Dalton was struggling to regain control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. But she knew better than to celebrate too soon. Dalton was a man of authority, and if there was one thing people in power hated, it was being challenged. He wasn't going to back down that easily. When the court reconvened, Dalton's demeanor had shifted. Gone was the passive confidence he'd walked in with earlier. Now his jaw was set, his expression unreadable. Whitaker remained seated beside him, but this time his posture was more reserved. He had no intention of intervening. At least, not yet. Dalton cleared his throat. "Ms. Bondi, you've presented compelling arguments." His tone was measured, but Pam caught the tightness in it. He wasn't used to conceding anything. However, he continued, "This court still finds that the core issue remains unchanged." A pause. "The fine stands." Pam blinked once. Interesting. So he was doubling down. She exhaled slowly, nodding as if carefully considering his words. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to the court stenographer. "Can you read back the last statement, please?" The stenographer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, barely hesitated before repeating, "The fine stands." Pam turned back to Dalton. "Your Honor, just so I understand correctly, are you stating, on record, so a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof?" Pam said, her voice steady. "In direct contradiction to established appellate precedent?" Dalton's fingers twitched against the bench. "Ms. Bondi, this court has discretion." Pam's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "It does," she conceded. "But discretion is not immunity from legal standards." Across the room, the city attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing where this was going. Pam straightened, stepping closer to the bench. "Let's put this in plain terms, shall we? If this ruling stands, it sets a precedent, one where any enforcement officer can issue a fine based on nothing more than their word." She let that settle before continuing. "No evidence, no documentation, just an assertion." Dalton's silence told her everything she needed to know. Pam turned to the gallery, sweeping her gaze across the attorneys, clerks, and bystanders who had sat through the hearing. "Imagine the implications of that," she said. "A business owner, fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner penalized for something they can't even verify. And if they challenge it?" She paused. "Too bad. The court has discretion." A few heads nodded subtly. Pam turned back to Dalton. "That's not discretion, Your Honor," she said evenly. "That's unchecked authority." The weight of her words pressed into the room. Finally, Whitaker spoke. "You're arguing that allowing this fine to proceed without evidence would undermine due process?" Pam nodded. "Not just due process, judicial integrity." Her voice was firm. "Because the moment we accept rulings based on assertion rather than evidence, the entire legal system begins to erode." Dalton's grip on the bench tightened. He knew he had been backed into a corner. The city attorney finally interjected. "Your Honor, if I may." Dalton held up a hand. His face remained unreadable, but Pam caught the frustration in his eyes. There was no winning this, not for him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dalton exhaled. "This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement." His voice was stiff, reluctant. "The fine is overturned." A murmur rippled through the room. Pam gave a slow, polite nod. No satisfaction. No gloating. Just quiet certainty. Dalton tapped his gavel against the bench. Court adjourned. Just like that, it was over. Pam gathered her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. As she turned to leave, she caught Whitaker watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she stepped toward the exit, "Ms. Bondi." She turned. Dalton's eyes met hers. "I underestimated you," he admitted. Pam gave him a small smile. "You wouldn't be the first." And with that she walked out, her heels clicking against the polished floor. But as she left, she knew one thing for certain. This case wouldn't just be forgotten. It had set a precedent, one that would ripple far beyond this courtroom. And somewhere, in another case, another judge would think twice before assuming they held all the power. Pam walked down the marble hallway, her pace steady, her mind sharp. She had come in expecting a routine hearing, What she got instead was a battle of power, law, and ego, and she had won. But she also knew something else. People like Dalton didn't forget moments like these. They didn't like losing, especially not in front of a full courtroom. As she neared the courthouse exit, a voice called from behind. "Ms. Bondi, a moment." She turned to find Judge Whitaker approaching. His expression was still unreadable. He wasn't the kind of man who engaged in unnecessary small talk, so if he was stopping her now, it wasn't just to exchange pleasantries. Pam crossed her arms loosely. "Something on your mind?" Whitaker studied her for a moment before speaking. "You're good." Pam smiled slightly. "I try." He nodded, glancing briefly at the courtroom doors behind him, before lowering his voice just enough so only she could hear. "Wasn't brought in to observe, Ms. Bondi." His eyes locked onto hers. "I was brought in to contain." Pam raised an eyebrow. "To contain what exactly?" Whitaker exhaled, his gaze unwavering. "Judge Dalton doesn't like losing. And in this case, it wasn't just about a fine. It was about setting an example. Pam already knew that. But hearing it confirmed only made the victory feel more significant. She kept her voice even. "So what happens now?" Whitaker hesitated, then gave her a look that held both respect and warning. "You'll have people watching you," he said, "and not just here." Pam understood exactly what he meant. Today she had done more than win a case. She had challenged the system that thrived on compliance, and that didn't go unnoticed. She nodded once. "I appreciate the heads up." Whitaker gave her one last look before turning back toward the courtroom. Pam turned toward the exit. Pushing open the heavy courthouse doors, Pam stepped into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt different, lighter, sharper. This wasn't the first battle she had fought in a courtroom, and it wouldn't be the last. But today's fight carried a lesson, one she hoped others would recognize. Power wasn't about who sat behind the bench. It wasn't about titles, robes, or authority. It was about knowing the rules well enough to challenge them. It was about standing firm when others expected you to back down. And most importantly, it was about never assuming that just because someone handed you a ruling, you had to accept it. Pam Bondi had walked into that courtroom expecting a routine, hearing. She walked out having reminded everyone, especially those in power, that the law wasn't just about enforcement. It was about understanding. It was about pushing back. And today, she had done exactly that.